This is the Red Podcast.
It's Red Podcast, the marketing podcast for experts. You've got a message, you want to spread that message. That's what this podcast is about. You are in the right place. You want to bring people to your podcast, have more people read your book, more people care about your message, make more money with your message. You are going to love this episode because it is all about communication. If you're a regular listener, you'll know this. This is the first time hearing my voice. Maybe you hear that Southern accent. I'm from Nashville. Nashville is the buckle of the Bible Belt. Not everybody goes to church here, but a lot of people do. I would argue that it is as much of the culture here as the music industry. In fact, growing up, I had the combination of two of those things. My first recording session, I was 5 years old. I did a record for the United Methodist Church. The big worldwide organization, United Methodist Communications. And that kind of got me into the business. Also, just down the street, my best friend's father, he was a copywriter for something called The Upper Room. It's a Christian publishing house. So all of my life, I've been exposed to both the religious element of church and also the business of church. But still, the correlation between business and church wasn't something that I really thought about until years later. Not only the money of church, but also getting people into the church building and buying church stuff, like that record I was on. I thought it just happened. When I was a kid, I knew two things. One, everybody around here played music, and two, everybody around here went to church. Wayne Geiger is my guest on this episode. He is a radio guy, but also a Baptist minister. He's also a college professor who teaches speech and communication. I talk about this stuff a lot here on Red Podcast, maybe not the religious aspect, but certainly filling live events, which in his case is church services. So I think you're going to appreciate this conversation from this perspective and get a lot out of it, even if you're not religious. Everything we're talking about here relates to your expert business. Wayne, you have done two things. They're related to each other that I think most experts and business owners would be surprised to find out are very similar to what they do. The first is that you're a lead pastor of First Baptist Church in Grain Valley, Missouri, and you've been preaching for 2 decades there, so you're very experienced. But you also have the same level of experience with radio. 25 years in Christian radio, serving as station manager, but also hosting and co-hosting morning shows.
And added to that as well, an adjunct professor of speech at a college here. I've been doing that for about a decade as well. And like you said, David, those things kind of interrelate. There's a little difference or a facet to that diamond, but they all interconnect together.
Well, I want to talk about that because you're in front of a big crowd every week as a pastor. Mm-hmm. Also, with your background in the media industry, just like you and I are right here, you're talking into a microphone, you can't see the person on the other side, but that's potentially even more people. Mm-hmm. So there's some similarities, there's some differences there. Let's start out with your work as a lead pastor. I want to talk about keeping people engaged with your message. I grew up as Methodist, and I didn't have a choice whether or not I attended church. It was something that my family did, so I was there with them.
You had a drug problem. You were drugged to church every Sunday.
Most people, I'm assuming, maybe there's social pressure in some places more than others perhaps, of, hey, you better be seen in church or else you're going to be in trouble with the town that you're in.
Right.
I would say that there's a lot of pressure on the pastor that I never thought of. You're the guy, right? They're coming for you. Let's talk about that for a minute. Talk about getting people in and keeping them engaged with the message.
And that's the bottom line, getting people in and getting them engaged, as part of the faith community. One of my passions is just getting the word out there, getting people to understand who God is, what the Bible says to them. And when I look out on a general, Sunday morning, I'm looking at a various audience as far as demographics are concerned, hugely different. Although, we're regional, like every principality has their own, who they are, their identity. We're in the Midwest. I know my community, I know my people who are here, but for the most part, they're all over the gambit as far as where people are. But the bottom line is getting them engaged. And for me, what I found, and as you mentioned earlier, and you're spot on, talking about how mass communication and adjunct professor in speech and preaching all tie together, I realize that you've got to get that message to people so that they understand it. There's got to be clarity there. There's got to be an identity there. They have to identify with the message, and that message has to be spoken clearly into where they're living right now at the moment. The average attention span is about 8 seconds. We've got to re-engage people every 8 seconds because the mind is a processor. We can speak at about 150 words per minute, but our brain processes at about 400 to 600 words per minute, which means you and I can sit up, we can look at the speaker, we can nod our head in agreement, and the whole time we're thinking about, where are we going for lunch today? Or, what's my favorite football team going to do this afternoon? We're engaged, but we're not really engaged. As a public speaker and as a pastor, I realize I have to continually come back and re-engage my audience. And there's different ways to do that. But for me, the bottom line has got to be, what do I want to say? What do I need to say? And how do I engage this audience, if that makes sense?
So let's contrast that with being on the radio. Was your radio focused to a certain demographic? I guess what I'm getting at is it seems like it would be very difficult, with older people, with younger people, with a youth group, with whatever, singles ministry, to get all those people to pay attention to you. And is there a different way you looked at that than you would like media, where maybe you're focusing on women 18 to 24?
The cool thing about being a pastor and looking out at your audience is you have the opportunity to adapt to feedback. When I look out and I'm seeing, for example, we have several services. One of the services has more youth that are there. So I may say something in the second service that I might not say in the first service because I have a younger demographic. I look over, I see them, and I think, oh yeah, here's a way that I can take this message and craft it to this particular target demographic. This is what I want to say to them. There's going to be a different message, perhaps, and a different delivery style, where I might try to speak within their language, where I may not do that to an older demographic. Now, when you're talking about radio and broadcasting, one of the things behind radio that most people don't understand, I guess, or don't think about with a radio station, stations will target a particular demographic. They want to go after a genre, a country station, for example. They're going to target that country demographic, people who enjoy country music. Generally, if you think about country music, you think about America, you think about maybe things that go along with that country setting. When you think about rock, an image comes to your mind of a particular person or person that's going to connect to that music. And the same is true with a Christian genre. And we know generally who is listening at a particular time. So as far as a radio station goes, bottom line, you have to survive. I mean, everybody understands that. As far as a business goes, you have to be able to pay the bills at the end of the day. Who is going to support that radio station? Who's going to buy your product? I worked for stations that were listener-supported, which means we had to drive the revenue from our listeners. We were asking them to give. So we had to deliver a product to a person who was going to be able to say, I value this product, and I'm willing to be able to pay, to invest, to keep this on the air. So we knew that we were going to target, and as you mentioned, that particular demographic, maybe 18 to 34-year-old female. That's who our target demographic is going to be. We would actually paint this person. Who is this target demographic? And I remember sitting in meetings, and we named her Jennifer. She was about 28 years of age. She drove a minivan. She's got 2 kids, taking them to school, busy lifestyle. Things are pretty tough at home, connection between her and her husband. And we painted this picture. So when we would get behind the microphone to try to visualize, when you're behind a microphone, as you know, David, you don't see anything but the studio, and you see the microphone. And you have to be able to speak beyond the microphone into the heart and into the soul of the person who's listening on the other end. And by faith, you have to believe that they are there and that they're listening, because there's no feedback. If I try to make a joke, for example, I can't see a smile or hear the chuckle. Or if I bring in a story that has heart to it, I'm not going to be able to see any emotion on the other end. I just have to believe that it is there. Now, when you're working with a co-host, oftentimes you can play off of them because you see that feedback. But when you're by yourself, when you're doing a podcast or something like that, it's very difficult to do that. But you just have to believe that you are connecting. And with a radio station, we were able to do Nielsen ratings and that kind of thing to find out who's listening. We would do constant research. who's listening, why are they listening, what are they listening for, what are we doing well, and what are we doing poorly, and how can we improve? At the end of the day, there are some huge similarities between what I do as far as being behind a pulpit and broadcasting behind a microphone, but at the same reality, there is a huge difference. And it comes down to knowing who your target audience is and how are they going to adapt to that feedback.
With your broadcasting, was it very similar to what you do with church, that you were talking to people one-on-one? Did you guys do call-ins? I mean, how did you keep in touch with people as individuals when you were broadcasting? Because I think that's one of the things that podcasts, we're really behind on that comparatively, because we don't have call-ins, we don't have neighborhood events, because we're not geographic in our tower. We can go everywhere. Did you do things that were trying to keep in touch with people as individuals to keep you better connected, or was it all based on ratings?
One of the things that I was required to do, generally when you're hired on as a quote-unquote talent behind the microphone, there's some things that you sign up to do. You have to be involved in the community. You would do various things where you'd be out in the community, maybe do some live broadcasts, meet people, that type of thing, which, interestingly enough, and I don't know how many studies have been done on this, but many radio personalities that I have known have been truly introverted. They enjoy being behind the microphone. They can say things generally that they would not say in a face-to-face interaction, one-on-one with an individual. So they're very introverted, and that surely was in my case. Classic introvert, and then getting outside of that and meeting people was very difficult for me, because a listener has expectations. When they met me, they would say, oh, I know who you are. You talk about your family, you talk about your dog, you talk about your job and your loves and your passions, and I feel like I know you. And oftentimes listeners would say that, wow, I know you, we're friends. And so getting out in the community and being able to connect with them, you have this database in your mind that I'm trying to store these people. Oh, okay, this is who I'm talking to. I remember meeting this person at a concert, and, we had a great conversation about how this song that we played or this thing that I said really connected with them. So you're able to build up that avatar from different facets of who they are and what they look like. So getting out in the community is a really big way to be able to do that and to meet people. And there have been times, David, like in my preparation as a pastor, where, Sunday morning is quote unquote showtime. I mean, that's the delivery. I'm up there delivering a message that I've been working on all week. Sunday morning when the message comes out, I mean, that's just the delivery. But the preparation has taken place all week long, or perhaps even longer than that, where I think about a passage that I'm looking at from the Bible and how is this going to connect to that young female out there who's looking for a relationship, questioning whether or not she needs to go to college, or if she wants to go out into the workforce, or if she wants to get married, what does she want to do? So I've got that in my head, along with a senior citizen who's going to have surgery coming up in a couple of weeks. So as I'm formulating the message a week ahead of time, I'm getting all those avatars, all those thoughts together into one message to try to connect to every single person that I can that's in there. Once I'm behind the microphone or once I'm in front of the audience, I may change things based upon that feedback where I see them. But for the most part, I already know most of what I'm going to say because I've already built that in the preparation. And the same thing with a podcast. I mean, you know what you're going to say. You come out with your scheme, you've got your outline, your thoughts, you've got your pithy statements of what you're going to say. But in your preparation, you've got to be able to come back to say, all right, who am I speaking to? What's the message that I want to get across? And what's the best way in order to be able to deliver that? So there are some huge similarities to doing that. But I hear what you're saying on a podcast. It's just you and the microphone and a room and some recording software,
Yeah.
It's very difficult to be able to do that.
And you hope it gets heard.
Right.
I want to make a comment on knowing what I'm going to say. Mike Tyson has that quote. It says, everybody's got a plan till you get punched in the face. And that's how I feel like when I'm on radio or doing podcasts. It's like, yeah, I think I know what I'm going to say. When you're doing a sermon, all eyes on you, you've been working on it all week. Do you pretty much stick to the script? How do you balance that? Like, having that improvisation? Because I would think that being in church, not only all eyes on you, but it's a religious institution. There's probably more pressure on you than there would be on me speaking at a business meeting, for example, to kind of keep it in between the lines. How do you balance that and figure out the risk of, I could go here, but maybe not?
I was just thinking about that the other day. You learn things. The best way to learn is by making mistakes and then not repeating them, hopefully.
Right.
That's the overall goal. So you get to know your audience, number one. Your audience has expectations. I teach public speaking as a professor, and one of the things I tell my class, your listener has expectations. Aristotle talked about ethos, your credibility, who you are in front of that audience. You cannot violate those expectations. You have a certain message to deliver, and you can't violate that. I operate within that spectrum. As I am preparing, and I've been at this particular church for 5 years now, so I know the people. I know what I can say. I know what I should not say, and I operate within those two spectrums. Now, there are times, for example, in this last past week, where sometimes you have to say some pretty tough things as a pastor. I remember preparing them, and I said, okay, this is going to hurt. Some of you are going to need to pick your toes up because I'm going to step all over them. And they kind of laughed, and they had those expectations from a pastor. They want to hear the hard things sometimes, but it comes down to knowing who your target audience is and what needs to be said. And at the end of the day, as a pastor, I have a higher calling within the faith community as a pastor to deliver a message, I believe, that's been driven by God from the Scriptures. So at the end of the day, I'm not here to make anybody comfortable. I'm here to speak the truth in love, as what the Bible says. And for the most part, my congregation here just appreciates that. If I began to sugarcoat it or just steer away from some difficult concepts or scriptures, they would not appreciate that. So they have expectations. They know what they hired me to do. And what they hired me to do was to speak the truth.
So let's stay on that thread, because I think that in the business world, definitely anybody who's in the Christian business, let's say you're a musician, a Christian musician, or a Christian book author, I feel like they've got a very tough line to walk since everyone has their own version of Christianity. For example, Dave Ramsey, some people would say, oh, he's great. He's a man of God. He's paying in cash. And other people will say, well, his house is too big. It puts you under a microscope. Thinking about things like that, let's talk about expectations and giving the message that people might not want to hear. I'm curious about some of the pushback that you've gotten from your congregation, maybe even when you first came in, because they were used to how the last guy did it, right. And now there's you. That's a tough situation to walk in general, but then when you're bringing in a religious philosophy, I would think that ups the ante just a little bit.
And again, it comes down to getting to know your people. A wise pastor told me decades ago, he said, Wayne, when you get in front of your church, they don't often listen to what you have to say, but they want to know who you are, and you need to love them. And I thought, many years ago, that was the most ridiculous thing anyone's ever said to me. But I realized he was absolutely true. He was absolutely right. You've got to know your target audience. You've got to know who they are. You've got to love what you do. And you've got to really feel a passion for what you do. And you've got to decide why you're doing it. I remember years ago working at a radio station in New Orleans. I was program director, and I was also in charge of putting the music on. My ultimate goal was getting the right song on the radio. Now, there's such tremendous pressure that comes from various sources. From Nashville, for example. Play this song, everybody else is playing it, why aren't you playing it?
Right. Look
what the ratings are doing. So-and-so station in California is playing it, and they're playing it in Houston, and they're playing it in New York. Why are you not playing it in New Orleans? So there's tremendous pressure that's there.
Right.
And, hey, we feel this is the next best band that's out there, and we're putting a lot of resources. We would really appreciate if you would play it, which gets awful close to payola, if you're not careful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
But I found so much pressure from that. It was not enjoyable whatsoever. I do not want to sit in this chair where I decide at the end of the day what 3 songs or 4 songs I might try out this week, because it's a science. What most people don't understand with broadcasting and radio, it is a science. These songs are tested. The groups are tested. And if they don't perform well, they don't get added. You have small groups and large groups where this stuff is tested. You might get 20, 30 songs a week wanted to consider, and you might add 2.
Right.
At the end of the day, you just have to say, this is who I am, this is my passion, this is my target, I'm called to a deeper purpose, and this is what I'm going to do. Obviously, you have to be able to survive out in the world. You've got to connect to who your audience is, and you've got to make a living at the end of the day. For me, being a pastor, the nice thing is I feel I have a calling to proclaim the word. And if the Bible says it, I've been trained in seminary, so I go back and I study the history, I study the geography, I study the culture, I study the context, and draft that or adapt that into a contemporary society. But there's some things that you just have to proclaim the truth in love. The Bible says, for example, you need to forgive. And someone would say, well, I don't want to forgive because you don't know what this person did to me. And I would say, you're absolutely right. I don't know what that person did to you. But what I do know is what Jesus said, that we are to love and to forgive no matter what anyone else has done. And that's a hard message to hear, but it is the truth. Now, I can identify with that person, and I can say, yeah, I understand your struggle. There's people that I have not wanted to forgive, but I know that God has forgiven me. Therefore, I need to forgive others. And that's a biblical message that I have to transfer to a community that sometimes just doesn't want to hear that. And sometimes they may get mad. But I can't soften the message. All I can do is try to communicate that message properly as a messenger of God and communicate that to the audience to which I speak on a regular basis.
Well, let's think about that. So you're a pastor, preacher, expert, teacher, guru, head guy, the guy that everybody is looking to. You've got this message, and in some ways, they're looking to you as maybe being a step above or somebody who's done a little bit more research. So I think that's something that we all share in common. You mentioned something about being listener supported, and I want to dive into that for a minute because I think sometimes teachers, preachers, pastors, perhaps you can tell me if this is true, we soften the message because we want to keep people coming in the doors, or we want to keep clients, or we want to get business. Does that happen in the Christian church as well?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And every person, every church, every pastor or minister has to make a choice. Studies have shown, young people are just leaving the church. They're not coming in the doors. So what do you do to reach a younger demographic? There are several camps. We need bigger fog machines. We need better lights. We need a better band, better singers. We need to give free tattoos away in the foyer. We need to serve lattes. And there are others, me, for example, who says, you know what, why don't we just stick to the tried and true message? We want to have a comfortable environment. We want to be open. We want to have great music. And, but we're not going to build it around a show. We don't come to a show. What we do is come to a worship service, and we present God and His Word. And particularly in my case, David, at the end of the day, I just say what the Bible says. Where I am, God has just been blessing, and I'm very thankful for that. We're reaching all demographics, and people are coming in. And the best thing that anyone can ever say about me, the best compliment, is not that I'm a great preacher. But the best compliment that anybody can give me is, you know what you said today was really clear. I really understood that from that message, from that place in the Bible. I understand now what that says, where I've never seen that before. There is a choice that every person has to make. And that's not a bad thing. For example, if you're outside of the church and you're just doing a podcast and you want to be able to support your podcast, you have to get listeners in order to be able to do that. But what you need to think about, and this was true in Christian radio, who is your target demographic and who is giving? There are often times where you need to target those people who are giving to make sure that they are connected, to make sure that they are fed, and not out there on the fringe and maybe not giving. So you want to speak to your core audience and hold them close. It's like a family. I've got 4 kids, and I recognize them all, feed them all, take care of them all. If a stranger comes to the door and says, hey, when's dinner? I'd be like, I don't. Who are you again? We take care of our family. We understand that. And then we help others. And the same is true with a business. Who is your target, who you're trying to reach, And what are your goals? What are you trying to do? I think a lot of podcasters say, I need to get a bigger audience. If I get a bigger audience, then maybe I can get the support that I need. Well, that may be true for some, but it may be not that you need a bigger audience. You may just need to drill down a little bit deeper with the audience that you have and be able to connect the heartstrings with the people that you have and deliver a product to them as a unique market that no one else is doing, that they are willing to pay for. You've got to make that decision. Now, for me in the church, it would be a compromise if I did the opposite. I feel, to a higher calling. I've got to answer to God. So therefore, it's a no-brainer. I make these decisions based upon what I feel God wants me to do. Now, I'm not going to be cruel about it. I'm going to be very loving, very kind, and try to communicate the message as I feel the Lord would have me to do that. But truth is truth. I can't get away from that. And out in the world, that's a different story.
You mentioned the guys from Nashville trying to get you to play records, and I was that guy for a number of years.
And I'm sorry I didn't play your song, David. It was a great song. But
Well, something you just said reminded me of young David when I was just getting into the music industry. It was very precious to me. I was a musician myself, and I'd grown up in Nashville, and music was something special to me. And then you get hit with the harsh reality that it is a business. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode, I never really considered the church being a business when I was growing up. I was like, yeah, everybody just goes to church. That's what you do when you're in the buckle of the Bible Belt. That's what we do. I'm curious to know if you getting into seminary and becoming a pastor, do you ever feel like, hey, this is just a business and I'm caught up in something that I don't want to be caught up in?
I think everybody goes through that. And whatever they do, sometimes you forget the why because you get so caught up in the what. Doing the 9 to 5 every single day, got to go to this meeting, got to do this thing, and you forget the why and the passion for why you do that. I'm very blessed where I am right now. We've been here, like I said, almost 5 years. And I'm so thankful that in about 6 months, we'll be debt-free. A lot of churches carry debt, building a building, doing this or doing that. I'm so thankful that in 6 months, we'll be debt-free. And God has blessed us. Let me say it that way. We have no problem making the budget. It's not been a big deal. But it's going to be nice not to have that hanging over our head. And I would prefer not to be in that place. Because, David, I've had friends who have told me in larger churches that, here we are in the Midwest, weather, you never know what it's going to do from one day to the next. But I've had friends who say, I don't care if it snows, if it ices or something like that. We have to have service because we have to pass the offering plate. Mm-hmm. We cannot miss a Sunday. We will not survive. And I've thought about that oftentimes, and I've thought, God, I don't want to be in that place because I would not want to compromise who I am as a person. I don't want to compromise the message in order to get more revenue. I don't believe at all that's where God wants us to be. God loves a generous, faithful giver, people who give from the heart. And I believe that a healthy church will grow. It's like any organism that's provided with the necessary things it needs to grow within a church. If it's healthy, I believe that it will grow and God will take care of it. And I don't want to change the lights, dim the lights, get the fog machine, come up with different various schemes to get people to be able to give or something like that. There's a fine line between offering people the opportunity to get involved or manipulation. And I teach public speaking and I teach persuasion. So I know the difference. I know how to manipulate people. When I was in radio, for example, for decades, as a listener-supported station, we would have, you've probably heard them, the care-a-thons, the share-a-thons, the beg-a-thons, getting people to give. Yep. And we would have teams come in and say, here's what you do, here's how you say it, blah, blah, blah. And I got to the point sometimes where I was just like, I don't want to do this. I feel dirty sometimes at the end of the day. I don't want to say this thing. At the end of the day, I just needed to go home and be able to put my head on the pillow and be able to go to sleep thinking I didn't take advantage of anyone improperly. I invited them to be able to give and to participate in the ultimate mission, but I didn't twist anybody's arm. I have to be able to live with myself. I will have to answer to God for those things. I don't want to be in a place where I would ever want to manipulate anyone or take advantage of anyone. I've heard it said, Barnum, the circus guy, said years ago, there's a sucker born every minute, and time's a wasting. So you could take advantage of people. I mean, there are people out there who do that on a regular basis, but I just have to answer for myself. And I'm glad that I'm not in a position where I would think about sacrificing my integrity.
Yeah, regarding that quote, I have heard that the actual quote is, there's a customer born every minute. I've never verified that, but yeah, certainly there's a sucker born every minute. That's I'm so glad you mentioned that, though, because I feel that being a marketer, and we're all marketing something, whether it's a religious philosophy or a how-to information or entertainment or ourselves. I see a lot of podcasters, and as you mentioned, like radio guys, podcasters being introverts, they have a hard time striking that balance between asking for something like, hey, this is a business, here's my offer, and assuming everybody knows. They assume everybody knows. The church, again, to take it back to the very beginning of the episode, I just assumed that everybody knew that you had to give money. They passed the collection plate. How much in like fundraising do you think about that? Like, we have to let people know that there's an offer. We have to let them know that we need something for like the new gymnasium or the new choir robes or something. I'm curious to know more about your thoughts on that. Can you talk more about finding the balance and the line on that?
And I can only speak to that from a personal perspective, but for me, everybody has a different faith perspective. I happen to be in a Baptist church, and one of the things that I truly believe that I've brought to the table here, and I think that people here appreciate and understand, is I like total transparency. And I learned that from the business world, from broadcasting. I learned it from speech. People will forgive you if you tell them the truth and you make a mistake. For the most part, people will forgive you if you just show yourself to be human. So I like to be totally transparent. And one of the things that we have here as a Baptist church is we have a budget in which we operate off of. And every single person here has the opportunity to be able to see that budget. And not only that, but they have the opportunity to be able to vote on that. We have various committees, we have teams who put budgets together, near the end of the year and say, hey, this is what we would like to do, and we'll put that in the budget, and the church will get together and vote on it and say, yeah, we like that idea, or no, we don't think that we'll be able to do that in this next year. So we make a lot of those decisions as a team, which is nice, because the more people you can involve in the process, it makes it seem like it's, they're part of the team, they're part of the family, and it's part of their idea. So if we're all together and say, this is what we want to do, the next 5 years, everybody's on board, and you would hope that the money will follow mission. Everybody says, yeah, I'm on board with that, and I'm willing to do that. But if you don't have a positive response, then you have to think about doing something else. So for me, I like total transparency. I've been in churches where it was a struggle sometimes to meet the budget. And we had to come out sometimes and say, hey, this is where we are, this is what we need. And that is a really bad place to be. I've seen this in broadcasting as well, like with a listener-supported station. From a listener's perspective, now, I was a broadcaster, but you have to think of it from a listener's perspective. If a radio station comes out, for example, and says, hey, you know what, if we don't get another $5,000 in this next couple of hours towards this mission, we may not be able to operate. In my mind, as a listener, I would think, why would I want to give to a sinking ship?
Yeah.
I want to give to something that's sustainable. I want to give to something that is going to make a difference. I want to be able to invest my resources in something that's bigger than I am, that's changing the world. So if you're coming to me saying, if we don't get this money, we're not going to survive, we're going to go off the air, I'm going to think to myself, I'll choose to invest somewhere else.
Well, there's also a trust element, too. I think about what Oral Roberts used to do. And I hope I'm not stepping on any toes with you.
No.
Like, I'm going to lock myself in a tower, and this is the way I remember it. And if you don't give money, we're all going to die, and the university is going to go bankrupt. And I think there are sometimes when you can pull that out, but pretty quickly people start to feel manipulated. And I know, just being in the buckle of the Bible Belt, I've certainly seen that with some of the Christian media.
Mm-hmm. They
have these like, oh, we're all going to die, we're going to have to take these satellites off the air. And then I think it's especially people are vulnerable to it because it is their faith, and they want to be good stewards of that faith, and they want to help people. But it's it's good to hear you think about this stuff, because I think some people, we don't realize, whether you're secular or a religious person, the power that being in front of people has.
That was tremendous. It's frightening sometimes. It is frightening to think about that, because I've told, my wife, sometimes I have to be careful what I say. If I come out on a Sunday morning and just say, and I've done this before, to say, oh, I just love pecan pie. The next week, there's a pretty good chance someone may make me a pecan pie. And that's frightening. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. Don't get me wrong. It's based upon a relationship. People love me, and they do that. But I think to myself, I've got to be very careful with my calling and with this power that's been entrusted to me. And I've got to be careful with what I say, because I could cross the line by being manipulative. And that's why I go back to the idea of transparency. I've worked for institutions who have said, hey, we've got to get people to give more. We've got to get them to be able to trust. They got to trust God. If they're not giving, they're not trusting God. Most people are thinking people. And I believe, for example, if as an institution or as a religious establishment, we're going to say, you need to give more, you need to trust God. In the same way, that pastor, pastoral staff, or that team needs to come back and say, we're going to trust God too. It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
As a pastor, I trust God that he's going to get the resources necessary to run this place. It's not about me at the end of the day. It's about him. I believe that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and he owns the hills themselves. So God is going to supply for what is necessary. Now, there's a big difference between having a need and having greed. If we start talking about, hey, we're going to, gold plate this, and I need a new jet, and I need this, and I need that, that's for me, crossing the line between need and greed. I mean, Jesus didn't wear a Rolex. He didn't come in a brand new car. He was very lowly. He was meek. He was humble. There were days he went without food, and that was a place of ultimate trust for him. And that's where I realized that I need to be. And the people that I minister to, they need to see that. Mm-hmm. They need to see that their pastor is just like them. He struggles. He has challenges. He needs to trust God just like they need to trust God. I mean, I don't drive a brand new car. I don't live in a huge house. I mean, my wife and I try to give away quite a bit of what we get. We try to live very minimally, very humbly, and be able to try to be very generous towards others, because I believe that's what God expects of everyone. And if God expects that of everyone, then I need to be the guy that leads the way. I need to be the servant leader. Rather than saying, this is what you need to do, to say, this is what I need to do. This is what the Bible says. This is what you need to do as well. Follow my example.
I think you just hit on something, though, that is such great advice for any expert. And I would argue that the guy you're talking about, Jesus, this is what Jesus did. Jesus set an example for everybody else to follow. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all experts or all business owners or all pastors are Jesus, but you're following that example, and people are following your example as well. As I talked about, the leader, the guru, the teacher, the pastor, the person up in front, we're looking for somebody to show us that something is possible. That's my belief, and show us that it's possible for us specifically.
Yeah. And again, that's the frightening thing. I say frightening because I'm a professor, I am a pastor, so I know the word, I understand it. If you said, in this particular book of the Bible, what's happening here, I could generally give you the history, I could talk about the chapter, I could talk about the culture, where most people can't do that. And I wish they could. I wish we could have this conversation where you understand what I understand, and it's just an aha moment for you where you get it.
Right.
But that doesn't always happen.
Right.
That's why within the church, God has called, I believe, pastors and teachers to be able to communicate that message. So I need to remember that. I need to remember that I need to take all that seminary education and all of that, I need to put it on the bottom shelf, and I need to just be able to spoon feed people to be able to understand that. But at the end of the day, if they don't see it happening in my life, they won't believe it. So at the end of the day, I am a role model and an example. That's shown in the scriptures.
Yeah.
Like you said, we're not Jesus, obviously. But Jesus himself said, follow me. So he is the ultimate example. We are to follow his methodology, who he was, what he did, how he ministered to people, how he loved people, how he stood up for truth. We need to emulate those things. But I can't preach one thing teach one thing and then live another thing, because people just won't believe it. They'll know I'm a fraud.
Well, I think people are looking for hypocrisy, especially with any kind of religion type element. I know working in the music industry, the Christian artists, I think they have it the toughest because people are just waiting for them to make a mistake. It's tough because everybody makes mistakes. I want to ask you one more question that I think every expert, everybody who's doing a podcast, doing books, but you'll especially relate to this as a morning radio jock, in that I think we're in a very tough time now with, I'm going to call it disposable content, just the churn and the amount of volume that people expect from us. I wrote a book for 4.5 years. That's what my latest book took. And the next week, somebody had read it. Okay, when's the next one coming out? It's like, no. It's it's going to be a little bit.
Right.
People don't understand the work that it takes to come up with this content. How do you balance that? Because I would think that having that Sunday message that you're delivering in person, there's more thought, more work that goes into it. You want it to stick around a little bit longer than maybe a bit that you've got on a morning radio show or something just in passing.
You are spot on with that, because as a society, we're always into the latest, greatest. What's the next thing coming down the pike? Oh, you had a book? Great. Well, when's the sequel coming out? We're always looking for that next thing that's coming out. But there's a point where you have to say, how much information do you need? I mean, have you implemented the basic truths that you've already learned? At the end of the day, that's what it's about. And I think most people are thinking there's just something out there that I'm not getting, and maybe it'll be in the next book, without stopping to be able to think and to be introspective and to allow, like your work, like your book, to be able to marinate their thoughts and build upon them themselves. That's the challenge. We're just in this world, like you said, where we feel like we need more information because we feel like we're missing something. And the reality is we just don't take time to be quiet and to be introspective and to think. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of folks' lives is just stopping and thinking. Talking to a couple of folks the other day about, putting a book out there because everybody else has a book out there. And my problem is, I speak from so many different arenas and genres. It's like, what would I write on? And my wife is wise beyond her years. She's like, why do you want to write it? I'm like, well, because you're supposed to do that. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to write a book. You're supposed to get it out there. She said, but why? And I'm like, that's a good point. It comes down to the why do you want to do that? And you have to back to the passion. What do you have to say that you think people need to know? And then say that, say it well, say it compellingly, and say it over and over again. It's the same thing with my speech classes when I tell my students, you've got 3 parts of a speech. You've got the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. You tell them what you're going to tell them. You tell them, and then in the conclusion, you tell them what you told them. Just reiterate and go back to those basic building blocks of what is important. As far as society, my friend Steve Miller used to say, time just keeps on ticking into the future. Just always looking for the next greatest thing.
I love Steve Miller. Sharp guy. Well, this has been so great, and you have a lot of great stuff online. Speaking of coming up with content, you've got some available. WayneGeiger.com is the website. You can search for Wayne Geiger. You're everywhere, and if you're ever in Missouri, drop by the First Baptist Church.
Absolutely.
Anything else that we didn't cover that I should have? Not a lot. I mean, there's obviously a lot, but one thing maybe?
I would say, David, with what you do, just helping podcasters be the best that they can be, I think that's such a critical market. And I think so many people out there are just looking to be like someone else. If I can just do it like them, I'll be someone. Just come back to who you are, your purpose, what you want to get across. And honestly, if you have 100 podcast listeners, man, be the best podcaster that you can be to 100 listeners. I used to get depressed sometimes working in mass communication broadcasting when some of the new models would come out and we'd say, we dropped our AQH, our average quarter hour, we dropped by this or by that, or we lost this, and it would be depressing without focusing on what are you doing that's good rather than what are you missing. So focus on who you have and build upon that audience and just deliver a good quality product to them. Be magnificent in what you do. Just be brilliant in what you do and hone that message for that target audience.
I love that. Lessons for podcasting and lessons for life. Well, Wayne, thank you so much for being here on Red. I'm going to definitely have to have you back because I love the parallels of secular and religious content and also in-person, face-to-face content versus media. And I think that you wrap that up in such a nice package.
Oh, thanks, David. I appreciate the opportunity just to be able to dialogue with you and appreciate the work that you do and pray God's richest blessings upon you and your listeners.
I will take it. I'm always looking for different takes on these subjects, spreading a message, filling seats, making the money work. If you've got somebody who would be a good guest for me, this is the URL to send them to. redpodcast.com/guests. That's plural, although I normally do one guest at a time. redpodcast.com/guests. And if you want more of this stuff, while you're there, subscribe. I've got different buttons for you depending on how you listen to your podcast. Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify. If you want an RSS feed, I've got it there. It's all at redpodcast.com. Also there, and speaking of spreading your message, I've got a podcast growth toolkit. Look at the very top of the site. Get the podcast growth toolkit. If you've got a podcast or you're thinking about doing a podcast, let me help you get the word out about it. It's a free download, redpodcast.com. It's right at the very top. Thank you for listening. I'll see you on the next episode of Red Podcast.